Imagine you're a German soldier in 1944, positioned on the front lines in France. Through your binoculars, you see an entire American armored division assembling in the distance. Hundreds of tanks, artillery batteries, the unmistakable rumble of diesel engines echoing across the valley. You radio headquarters. Intelligence confirms a major assault is imminent. Your commanders rush reinforcements to meet this overwhelming force. But here's what you don't know. Those tanks are made of rubber. Those sounds are playing from speakers hidden in half-tracks. And the soldiers you're watching are actually artists, designers, and sound engineers performing the most elaborate magic trick in military history. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, officially designated, rarely acknowledged. History remembers them by another name, the Ghost Army. Between 1944 and 1945, roughly 1,100 men conducted over 20 battlefield deceptions across Europe. They didn't fire weapons. They painted scenery. They recorded sound effects. They inflated balloons. And in doing so, they saved an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Allied lives. This is their story. By 1943, Allied planners faced a reality that kept them awake at night. The coming invasion of Europe would require concentrating massive forces at specific breakthrough points. But German reconnaissance was relentless and effective. Luftwaffe pilots photographed Allied positions daily. Signals intelligence tracked radio communications. Local informants reported troop movements. The equation was simple and brutal. Wherever Allied forces concentrated, German counterattacks followed. Every staging area became a target. Every assembly point invited artillery fire. Traditional military deception had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Camouflage nets concealed positions. Dummy equipment was left behind when real units moved forward. These were passive measures. Defensive thinking born from a mindset of hiding what existed rather than creating what didn't. But a small group of planners began asking a different question. What if deception could be weaponized? What if you could make the enemy see entire armies where none existed? What if their intelligence, their careful reconnaissance, their signal intercepts, their analytical reports could be turned into a liability rather than an asset? The conceptual seeds had been planted in North Africa. British forces under Colonel Dudley Clark successfully deceived Rommel's Afrika Korps, using dummy tanks made from plywood and canvas stretched over truck frames. When British armor actually struck, it came from unexpected directions while German forces prepared for attacks that never materialized from the dummy positions. The results were undeniable. Deception had proven capable of achieving what firepower alone could not, making a smaller force appear larger, making defensive positions seem offensive, making the enemy commit real resources to fighting phantoms. American planners took the concept further. They didn't want to simply hide real units or leave behind fake equipment as they advanced. They wanted to create entire fictional divisions that could move, communicate, and behave exactly like genuine military formations. Units that existed only as carefully orchestrated illusions but drew real enemy fire, real reconnaissance flights, real strategic decisions. The project required unprecedented creativity. This wasn't a job for traditional soldiers. It required artists who understood visual perspective, sound engineers who could manipulate acoustic signatures, radio operators who could forge electromagnetic identities, and designers who could think in 3 dimensions about how things appeared from aerial reconnaissance. In early 1944, recruitment began through the most unusual channels in military history. The recruitment notices were deliberately vague. Art schools across America received inquiries from Army personnel asking about students with particular skills: spatial reasoning, quick sketching ability, understanding of light and shadow, experience with large-scale design work. Advertising agencies were contacted about employees who could think strategically about visual communication. Sound studios received questions about engineers familiar with recording and playback equipment. The message was always the same: specialized, technical skills needed for classified work in the European theater. No combat experience required. Discretion essential. They came from lives that seemed impossibly distant from muddy foxholes and artillery barrages. Bill Blass was working in New York fashion when he enlisted. He would later become one of America's most celebrated designers, But in 1944, he was a private assigned to learn how to make fake tanks look real. Ellsworth Kelly had been studying at the Pratt Institute, developing the abstract visual language that would later make him famous. Art Kane was a young designer who would eventually photograph the most iconic jazz musicians of the 1960s. These weren't men who had grown up hunting or dreaming of military glory. Many had never fired a weapon. Their skills lay in understanding how the human eye interprets visual information, how perspective works from different angles, how light and shadow create dimension. The Army assembled them at Camp Forest in Tennessee, an installation normally used for artillery training. The surrounding countryside echoed with the sounds of howitzers and heavy weapons fire, a jarring introduction for men whose previous occupational hazards involved paper cuts and paint fumes. Initial training was conventional enough. Basic marching drills, military protocol, physical conditioning. The artists and designers found themselves learning to salute, maintain equipment, follow orders. For many, it was their first experience with military discipline. But then the training diverged into territory no other unit experienced. They learned camouflage theory, not just how to hide objects, but how to make objects appear to be something else entirely. Classes covered aerial perspective, how terrain features look from 5,000 feet, what shadows tanks cast at different times of day, how vehicle tracks appear in various soil conditions. They studied German reconnaissance procedures, learning to think like Luftwaffe photo analysts so they could create deceptions that would survive expert scrutiny. Sound engineering became a military discipline. The Army had recorded hours of audio, Sherman tanks moving in column formation, trucks in convoy, construction battalions building bridges, infantry companies assembling for inspections. Engineers taught the artists how these sounds traveled across different terrain, how atmospheric conditions affected acoustic range, how to position speakers to create convincing three-dimensional audio illusions. Radio protocol training was particularly intensive. The Ghost Army would need to generate fake communications that match the exact patterns of real military units. Radio operators learned not just official codes and procedures, but the subtle, personal variations that made each operator's transmission style unique, what signals intelligence called the fist of a radio operator. They practiced mimicking these personal signatures until they could convincingly impersonate specific operators from actual divisions. The technology they trained with was remarkable for 1944. The inflatable equipment represented cutting-edge materials engineering. Rubber companies that normally manufactured balloons, life rafts, and inflatable toys had been contracted to create military-grade deceptions. A genuine M4 Sherman tank weighed 30 tons and required a crew of 5. The inflatable replica weighed 65 pounds and could be carried by 2 men, inflated by 4 and 15 minutes using portable air compressors. From 200 yards away, even in daylight, the illusion held. The rubber had been molded to replicate every detail: bogie wheels, track links, turret hatches, antenna mounts. Paint schemes matched actual Army specifications. Weathering effects made them appear used rather than fresh from a factory. From the air, the primary German reconnaissance method, they were indistinguishable from genuine armor. The sonic equipment was equally sophisticated. Speakers powerful enough to project sound over 15 miles had been mounted on specially modified half-tracks. The vehicles looked unremarkable, but each carried sound systems that would have been at home in a major radio broadcast studio. Engineers could layer multiple recordings, adjusting volume and directionality to create acoustic signatures of entire mechanized columns moving through the landscape. As training progressed, the men began to understand the peculiar nature of their assignment. They would be non-combatants performing combatant duties. They would operate on active battlefields, but carry minimal weapons. Their survival would depend not on firepower but on convincing the enemy to shoot at empty fields while they worked. If captured, their status under the Geneva Convention was ambiguous at best. Were they soldiers? Artists? Spies? The rubber tanks and sound trucks wouldn't offer much protection during interrogation by the Gestapo. By late spring 1944, training concluded. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received orders for Europe. They packed their equipment, crates of inflatable tanks, spools of camouflage netting, recording equipment, radio gear, and boarded transport ships for England. Most still had no idea what their first operation would entail. But they knew it would happen somewhere in France sometime soon after the invasion everyone knew was coming. They were artists going to war. But instead of rifles, they carried paintbrushes. Instead of grenades, they carried rubber and canvas and wire. Their weapon was illusion. Their battlefield was the German mind. The Ghost Army arrived in France on July 15, 1944, more than a month after D-Day. The beachhead had been secured, but the fighting remained brutal. Allied forces were still contained in a relatively narrow coastal strip, grinding through the Norman bocage and agricultural landscape of small fields divided by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows that turned every advance into a close-quarters battle. Their first mission came with minimal preparation time. The 2nd Armored Division needed to reposition for a major breakthrough operation, but German intelligence was tracking their movements closely. If the 2nd Armored simply disappeared from their current sector, German commanders would know a significant strike was being prepared and would reinforce accordingly. The Ghost Army's assignment: make the 2nd Armored appear to remain in position while the real division moved to an entirely different sector 40 miles away. They had 72 hours. The deception team arrived at the 2nd Armored's positions after dark. Real tanks were already beginning to pull out under cover of night, moving along roads that had been cleared of French civilians who might inadvertently reveal the movement to German informants or reconnaissance. As genuine Shermans departed, Ghost Army trucks rolled in carrying deflated rubber replicas. Teams of 4 men worked through the darkness, unrolling the collapsed tanks, connecting air hoses, activating portable compressors. The night filled with the sounds of rushing air as the rubber took shape. The process was practiced but still nerve-wracking. Each inflatable had to be positioned precisely where actual tanks had been located. Reconnaissance photographs taken days earlier showed German intelligence exactly where American armor sat. The rubber replacements needed to occupy those same positions, but simply placing fake tanks wasn't enough. Real armored divisions created visual ecosystems. Tanks didn't sit in isolation. They were surrounded by support vehicles, supply dumps, maintenance areas, command posts, communication equipment. The Ghost Army had to replicate this entire visual signature. Trucks were parked in patterns matching actual motor pools. Camouflage netting was strung between trees in the same configurations the 2nd Armored had used. Tents went up in company street layouts. Latrines were dug in appropriate locations. Nothing could appear staged or artificial. One team specialized in what they called atmosphere, the small details that made positions look lived in rather than freshly established. They scattered empty ration boxes and cigarette butts. They hung laundry on makeshift lines. They created wear patterns in the grass where soldiers would walk between tents. They left jerry cans stacked near vehicle positions as if awaiting refueling operations. Another team worked on vehicle maintenance theater. Several of the inflatable tanks were positioned with engine compartments open, actually canvas flaps designed to simulate inspection hatches. Tools were scattered nearby. Oil drums were placed as if mechanics had been performing routine maintenance. One team even created fake oil stains on the ground beneath several vehicles. As dawn approached, the visual deception was complete. From the German observation post 2 miles distant, the American armored position looked unchanged, but visual deception was only one component. German intelligence relied heavily on signals intercepts. Radio traffic patterns were as important as visual reconnaissance. Ghost Army radio operators began transmitting on the exact frequencies the 2nd Armored had been using. They generated the same volume of communications, not too much, which would seem suspicious, not too little, which would suggest radio silence preceding an attack. They mimicked the personal transmission styles of actual 2nd Armored operators, recreating the subtle timing and rhythm that made each operator's fist distinctive. The messages themselves were carefully scripted. Supply requests, maintenance reports, routine administrative traffic. Everything was coded properly but designed to be intercepted and decrypted by German intelligence, revealing exactly what the Americans wanted them to know. The 2nd Armored remained in its current position, with no immediate plans for offensive action. Sonic deception added the final layer. At night, when sound traveled furthest and German listening posts would be most active, The half-tracks with their massive speakers moved into position along the tree lines, bordering the fake armored camp. The recordings began playing, diesel engines idling, the distinctive clank and rattle of tracked vehicles maneuvering, the pneumatic hiss of air brakes, occasional commands shouted in English. The volume was calibrated precisely. Too loud would seem obvious. Too soft wouldn't carry to German positions. The sound engineers adjusted for wind direction, humidity, terrain features that would affect acoustic propagation. For 3 days and nights, the Ghost Army maintained the illusion. During daylight hours, they remained hidden, keeping activity minimal to avoid drawing attention. At night, they moved between the positions, adjusting rubber tanks that had deflated slightly, maintaining the sonic broadcasts, keeping radio traffic at appropriate levels. German reconnaissance flights photographed the position daily. Artillery occasionally fired ranging shots at the dummy positions, terrifying moments when shells impacted near the inflatable equipment. One rubber tank took shrapnel damage, its side splitting open. The team patched it after dark and repositioned it slightly so the damaged side faced away from German observation. The men learned quickly that their equipment couldn't stop bullets, but their deception could redirect where those bullets went. Every shell that hit an empty field was a shell that didn't hit actual soldiers. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, the real 2nd Armored had reached its attack positions undetected. When they struck on July 25th as part of Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, German forces were completely unprepared. Their intelligence had assured them the 2nd Armored remained in its defensive sector. Reserves had not been repositioned. Defensive preparations were minimal. The 2nd Armored punched through German lines and drove deep into the rear areas, creating chaos that helped collapse the entire German defensive position in Normandy. Within days, the Allied breakout was racing across France. The Ghost Army had achieved exactly what it intended. A real military victory won through fake military equipment. But the success came with a price measured in pure stress. For 72 hours, approximately 100 men had operated on an active battlefield with minimal weapons, relying entirely on the enemy believing their rubber tanks were real. When the deception ended and they packed up their equipment, several men were physically shaking. One later wrote in his diary, "We learned something important. Fear doesn't come from seeing the enemy. It comes from knowing they're watching you and hoping they believe the lie you're showing them." The success of the Normandy operation established the Ghost Army's value. Commanders who had been skeptical about the concept now wanted deception support for their operations. Requests began coming in faster than the unit could respond, but each operation brought new challenges and new risks. The Ghost Army would need to refine their techniques, expand their capabilities, and repeatedly convince German intelligence that phantom divisions were real, while operating sometimes within artillery range of the forces they were deceiving. By September 1944, the Allied advance across France had created new problems. While most German forces retreated toward the German border, several major port cities remained under Nazi control, their garrisons ordered to hold at all costs. Without these ports operational, Allied supply lines stretched back to Normandy beaches, creating a logistical nightmare. Brest, a major port city on the Brittany Peninsula, held particular strategic importance. The German garrison there numbered approximately 35,000 troops under the command of General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a tough paratroop veteran who had no intention of surrendering. The city's fortifications had been strengthened over years of occupation. Taking it would require a sustained siege. The Wade Corps drew the assignment but faced a challenge. They didn't have enough troops to completely surround and assault the city simultaneously. German forces could potentially break out if they identified weak points in the siege lines. The Ghost Army received orders to make 8 Corps appear twice its actual size. This operation required different techniques than the Normandy deception. Rather than impersonating a static division holding defensive positions, they needed to create the impression of multiple combat units actively engaged in siege operations around a large urban area. The team split into smaller detachments, each assigned to different sectors of the siege lines. Their mission was to create phantom units that filled gaps in the actual Allied positions, convincing German reconnaissance that the noose around Brest was far tighter than reality. Inflatable artillery proved particularly effective. The teams positioned rubber howitzers in carefully selected locations, areas visible from German observation posts within the city. They didn't just inflate the weapons. They created complete artillery battery positions. Ammunition storage areas were simulated with stacked wooden crates painted to resemble shell containers. Fire direction centers appeared as tents with antenna arrays. Sandbag emplacements protected the dummy guns. To sell the illusion, they needed simulated muzzle flashes. The engineers had developed a technique using carefully measured charges of black powder in metal pans positioned at the muzzles of the inflatable guns. At night, teams would ignite these charges in coordinated sequences, creating flashes visible from German positions. The timing matched actual artillery fire patterns, not regular intervals which would seem mechanical, but the irregular rhythm of real fire missions. The sonic deception became more sophisticated. Rather than just playing recordings of armored movements, the sound engineers created acoustic scenarios matching siege warfare. At night, they broadcast sounds of construction work, engineers digging approach trenches, building fortifications. They played recordings of truck convoys delivering supplies to phantom units. Occasionally, they added sounds of infantry movements, boots on pavement, voices shouting commands. The broadcasts were never continuous. Real military operations have natural rhythms, periods of activity followed by quiet stretches. The Ghost Army matched these patterns, ensuring their phantom units sounded like actual formations conducting real operations rather than sound effects on a loop. Radio deception expanded significantly for this operation. They weren't just impersonating one division, but creating electromagnetic signatures for multiple fictional units. Radio operators generated traffic for phantom artillery battalions, engineer companies, infantry regiments, supply units. Each had to maintain consistent communication patterns with appropriate command relationships and standard military procedures. The challenge was coordination. Real military radio traffic forms an interconnected web. Units communicate with adjacent units, request support from higher headquarters, coordinate with supply chains. The Ghost Army had to create this entire web for their fictional forces. If a phantom artillery battalion requested ammunition resupply, a phantom supply unit needed to acknowledge and respond. If a fictional infantry regiment reported contact with enemy forces, adjacent phantom units needed to react appropriately. Team worked exclusively on what they called administrative theater. They created fake unit designation, signs, and posted them at road intersections leading to empty fields. They established dummy command posts with guards stationed outside, actual Ghost Army soldiers wearing the shoulder patches of fictional units. When French civilians passed by and saw American troops in positions throughout the siege lines, they naturally reported this information, which inevitably reached German intelligence through the various channels that existed even in occupied territories. The deception operated for 3 weeks, while the 8th Corps systematically reduced Brest's defenses. German forces inside the city never attempted a breakout. Their intelligence convinced them that Allied strength surrounding the city was overwhelming. Any breakout attempt would be suicidal. Post-war, interrogation of German officers revealed that their reconnaissance had identified what they believed to be more than twice the actual Allied strength besieging Brest. One German intelligence officer stated that aerial reconnaissance clearly showed artillery positions covering every possible escape route. He was describing rubber guns. Brest surrendered on September 19, 1944. General Ramke and his garrison entered captivity, and the port facilities, though heavily damaged, could begin reconstruction. The Ghost Army had evolved. They were no longer just making fake tanks sit in fields. They had learned to create entire operational theaters, coordinating visual, sonic, and electromagnetic deceptions into seamless illusions that convinced professional military intelligence analysts. But the war's most dangerous deceptions still lay ahead. What the official reports never adequately captured was the psychological burden of the Ghost Army's work. These men operated in a space between combatant and non-combatant that military doctrine had never really contemplated. Traditional combat, for all its horror, offers certain psychological protections. Soldiers fire weapons, see results, feel they're actively fighting. Even in defensive positions under artillery bombardment, troops can shoot back, take cover, feel they're doing something to affect their survival. The Ghost Army couldn't shoot back. Their survival depended entirely on the enemy believing a lie while standing close enough to detect it, if they looked carefully. Private Harold. Dahl kept a diary throughout his service, one of the few written records that captured the daily reality of deception operations. In October 1944, he wrote, "We spent 6 hours last night inflating tanks and artillery pieces while German positions were less than 3 miles away. Every sound we made felt amplified. Every time someone stumbled or dropped equipment, we froze, convinced we'd given ourselves away. Then morning came, and we had to sit in foxholes all day watching our rubber army through the same binoculars German observers were using. You start imagining what they're seeing. You start believing they must know. The waiting becomes worse than any combat I can imagine. The fear wasn't irrational. The Ghost Army operated at ranges where German artillery could easily reach them. If their deceptions were discovered, if a reconnaissance patrol penetrated close enough to touch the rubber tanks, if aerial photos revealed suspicious details, if signals intelligence detected anomalies in radio traffic, the response would be immediate and devastating. Several operations came terrifyingly close to exposure. During a deception near Metz in late October, a German patrol infiltrated to within 200 yards of Ghost Army positions. The team was in the middle of inflating replacement tanks for ones that had deflated overnight. Men froze in place, lying flat beside partially inflated rubber vehicles, barely breathing as German soldiers swept the area with binoculars. The patrol moved on without detecting the deception, but the incident rattled everyone involved. Sergeant Victor Dowd later recalled, "We realized we'd been saved by shadows and German assumptions. They saw shapes that matched what they expected to see, American armor, so their brains filled in the details. But if they'd come 50 yards closer, if the light had been different, if one of them had gotten curious enough to investigate more carefully, we'd have been completely exposed." The ambiguous nature of their military status created additional anxiety. Standard soldiers captured in uniform carrying weapons were prisoners of war, protected by Geneva Convention protocols, but the Ghost Army's status was murkier. Were they soldiers engaged in legitimate military deception, or were they spies and saboteurs using false pretenses? The question wasn't theoretical. German military doctrine treated partisan fighters, saboteurs, and spies with extreme prejudice. Summary execution was standard. The Ghost Army carried minimal documentation about their unit. Security protocols prevented them from carrying anything that might reveal their mission if captured. This meant they had limited proof of legitimate military status. Colonel Reeder, the unit commander, addressed this concern directly in a briefing recorded in November 1944. "If captured, identify yourselves by name, rank, and serial number. State that you are members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Provide no details about your mission. The Army will make every effort to establish your status as legitimate prisoners of war. But I won't lie to you, your situation would be complicated. German intelligence will be very interested in what you know." This knowledge affected how the men approached their work. They became obsessive about escape routes. Every operation included contingency plans for rapid withdrawal if the deception appeared compromised. Vehicles were always kept fueled and pointed toward friendly lines. Guard rotations were shortened so exhausted sentries wouldn't miss warning signs. Everyone carried detailed maps with multiple routes back to Allied positions marked. The stress manifested in various ways. Some men became hypervigilant, sleeping poorly, reacting intensely to unexpected sounds. Others developed dark humor as a coping mechanism. One popular running joke involved writing increasingly elaborate fake citations for medals they'd never receive. The Purple Heart with oak leaf clusters for wounds inflicted by hostile rubber, or the Bronze Star for valor in the face of imaginary enemy forces. But the humor couldn't entirely mask the genuine strain. The unit saw several cases of what would later be recognized as acute stress reactions, men who simply couldn't continue, whose nerves had been worn down by the unique pressure of their work. Private First Class George Martin broke down during an operation in Luxembourg. He'd been working radio deception, maintaining communications for a phantom division, when artillery started impacting nearby, not random harassing fire, but targeted rounds that suggested German forces might be zeroing in on radio transmissions. Martin became convinced the enemy had detected the deception and was about to overrun their position. He had to be physically restrained and was evacuated for psychiatric evaluation. The incident wasn't isolated. By December 1944, the unit's medical officer reported elevated cases of stress-related symptoms: insomnia, hypervigilance, gastrointestinal problems, tension headaches. The psychological toll of operating in sustained fear without the release of actual combat was accumulating. What made it more difficult was that the men couldn't talk about their work. Security protocols prevented them from discussing operations even with other Allied units. Letters home were heavily censored. They couldn't explain to family members why they were experiencing stress, couldn't describe what they were actually doing in France and Germany. This isolation extended to their relationship with conventional military units. Other soldiers saw them as rear echelon troops who drove around in trucks and didn't carry weapons. There was sometimes resentment. Why weren't these men in actual combat units? What made them special? The Ghost Army couldn't explain. They endured the subtle contempt, the questioning looks, the implications that they weren't really contributing to the war effort. Only their commanding officers knew the truth, and those officers couldn't defend them publicly without compromising security. Yet despite the psychological burden, the men continued their work with remarkable dedication. They understood that their unusual form of warfare saved lives. Every operation that successfully deceived German intelligence meant real soldiers attacked from unexpected directions, faced lighter resistance, suffered fewer casualties. Private Arthur Shilstone, one of the unit's artists, perhaps captured it best in a letter to his wife that somehow evaded censorship. We're not heroes. We're not even really soldiers in the traditional sense, but we're doing something that matters. Every fake tank we position means a real tank crew somewhere else is safer. Every decoy position we build means enemy artillery is shooting at rubber instead of people. It's the strangest war anyone could imagine, but it's ours and we're getting quite good at it. By March 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Allied forces had reached the Rhine River, Germany's last major natural defensive barrier. Crossing it would require massive force concentrations, and German defenders knew exactly where those crossings would likely occur. The Ghost Army received orders for their most ambitious deception yet. Convinced German intelligence that 2 entire American divisions were preparing to cross the Rhine at Viersen, nearly 30 miles south of where the actual crossing would occur. This operation would require coordinating every element of their deception capability on an unprecedented scale. It would also place them closer to concentrated German forces than they'd ever operated before. The genuine crossing, Operation Flashpoint, would occur near Rheinberg with the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions leading the assault. These units began moving into position in early March, carefully concealing their movements. They approached from directions that kept them masked from German aerial reconnaissance, moved primarily at night, enforced strict light discipline, and maintained radio silence. The Ghost Army would create the opposite impression at Viersen. They would generate every signature of 2 divisions, approximately 30,000 troops, hundreds of vehicles, extensive supporting equipment, preparing for a major river crossing. They wanted German reconnaissance to see exactly what the Allies didn't want them to see. The operation began on March 18th with what they called the infiltration phase, small Ghost Army. Teams moved into the Viersen area. Disguised as advance elements of the fictional divisions, they established command posts, set up communication facilities, began generating radio traffic, requesting supplies and engineer support for river crossing operations. The radio deception was particularly sophisticated. Operators didn't just generate generic military traffic. They created specific conversations that told a story. Phantom engineer battalions requested bridging equipment. Fictional artillery units discussed range calculations to the opposite bank. Supply officers inquired about stockpiling ammunition for the assault. Intelligence officers requested aerial reconnaissance photos of specific sectors across the river. All of this traffic was transmitted using procedures that ensured German signals intelligence would intercept it. Encryption was deliberately set at levels that German codebreakers could crack with moderate effort. The Americans wanted the messages read. They just wanted them to appear like intelligence coups rather than planted information. The visual deception followed in waves. First, reconnaissance elements appeared. Jeeps with radio antennae driving through the area, scout teams observing the river from different vantage points, liaison officers meeting with local military government representatives about billeting troops. Then supply dumps materialized. Stacks of wooden crates appeared in fields carefully arranged and covered with camouflage netting. Most were empty or filled with sawdust, but the arrangements matched actual supply protocols. Fuel dumps appeared with jerry cans stacked in proper pyramids. Ammunition storage areas were designated with appropriate signage and guard posts. The inflatable equipment deployment was the most extensive the Ghost Army had attempted. Over 3 nights, they positioned more than 600 pieces of dummy equipment: tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, half-tracks, jeeps, anti-aircraft guns. Each had to be placed according to proper military spacing and tactical arrangements. This wasn't just randomly scattering fake vehicles, it was creating the visual signature of 2 divisions in assembly areas. One team specialized in what they called living patterns. Real military camps have characteristic features: worn paths between tents, latrines positioned according to regulations, mess facilities with trash pits, maintenance areas with parts and tools scattered around. The Ghost Army created all of these details. They even staged activities during periods when German reconnaissance was likely. Small groups of actual Ghost Army soldiers would conduct visible drills in open areas, wear the shoulder patches of the fictional divisions, drive jeeps between dummy positions as if inspecting troops. From German observation points across the river, it looked like ordinary military preparation. The sonic deception ran continuously at night. Recordings of heavy equipment movements played from multiple locations, creating the impression of armor and artillery being positioned for the assault. Construction sounds suggested engineers building approach roads and staging areas. The acoustic signature was carefully layered, not all sounds at once, but shifting patterns that matched actual work cycles. To enhance the illusion, real engineer units created visible construction activity. They began building what appeared to be ramps and approach roads to the river, structures that would be used for launching assault boats and amphibious vehicles. The construction was genuine enough to appear functional, but was actually positioned in locations where crossing would be tactically unwise due to strong German defensive positions on the opposite bank. German response confirmed the deception was working. Aerial reconnaissance missions increased dramatically over Viersen. Artillery began registering ranges on the dummy assembly areas. Intelligence reports intercepted by Allied code breakers showed German commanders reinforcing defensive positions directly across from Viersen, pulling units from other sectors to strengthen what they believed would be the American crossing point. The psychological pressure on the Ghost Army men reached peak intensity. They were operating within easy artillery range of concentrated German forces, who were specifically watching for signs of a river crossing. Every day brought the risk that German patrols might infiltrate close enough to discover the deception. Every night brought the possibility of artillery strikes on their actual positions while they worked among the inflatables. Private Robert Tompkins later described the experience. "We could see German positions across the river with naked eyes. We knew they could see us equally well. Every movement felt exposed. You'd be inflating a rubber truck and you'd think, what if there's a German officer watching through binoculars right now? What if he notices something wrong? You kept working, but part of your mind was always calculating how fast you could run to the nearest cover. The deception required constant maintenance. Inflatable equipment deflated slowly and needed regular repressurizing. Items damaged by weather or occasional artillery fragments needed repair or replacement. Guard rotations had to maintain the appearance of active security around dummy installations. Radio traffic had to continue at appropriate volumes without repetition that might alert German analysts. For 18 days, the Ghost Army maintained the illusion. The real divisions prepared in silence 30 miles north. On the night of March 23rd, Operation Flashpoint commenced. The crossing achieved near-complete tactical surprise. German forces at Rheinberg were minimal. Most available reserves had been positioned at Viersen to counter the crossing they expected there. The 30th and 79th Divisions established bridgeheads quickly, facing lighter resistance than anticipated. German commanders didn't realize the truth until American forces were already across the river in force. By the time they attempted to redirect troops from Viersen, the bridgeheads had been consolidated and expanded. The opportunity to destroy Allied forces during their most vulnerable moment mid-crossing had been lost post-war. Analysis estimated that Operation Fearson saved between 2,000 and 3,000 American casualties. The men who inflated rubber tanks, played sound recordings, and transmitted fake radio messages had achieved what heavy artillery and bombers could not. They'd convinced the enemy to defend the wrong place, but success came with costs that didn't appear in official reports. Several Ghost Army men suffered stress breakdowns during or immediately after the operation. The sustained pressure of operating so close to enemy forces for such an extended period had exceeded what many could endure. One team had a particularly harrowing experience. While repositioning inflatable artillery at night, they came under sudden artillery fire, not random harassment, but what seemed like targeted rounds. The team scattered, abandoning their equipment and running for cover. Several men were wounded by shrapnel. When they returned after the barrage, they discovered the artillery fire had been random after all. Bad luck rather than detection. But the psychological impact remained. Those men had experienced the moment they'd all feared, being exposed and helpless while the enemy fired at them. Yet even with these incidents, the operation was considered a triumph. Operational deception had proven capable of influencing major strategic decisions. The Ghost Army had graduated from tactical tricks to operational-level warfare. They had also demonstrated something unexpected, that in modern warfare, where intelligence and reconnaissance were increasingly sophisticated, those same sophisticated systems could be turned into vulnerabilities. German intelligence had been excellent. Thorough aerial reconnaissance, effective signals intercepts, good analytical staff. But excellence in gathering information meant nothing if the information itself was false. The Ghost Army had weaponized the German military's trust in its own intelligence apparatus. After the Rhine crossing, the war's character changed dramatically. Germany's defensive lines had been breached. Allied armies poured across the river and drove deep into German territory. The rapid advance created new challenges for the Ghost Army. Deception operations now needed to happen at speed, often with minimal preparation time. Traditional military deception required time, days or weeks to establish false positions, build credible visual signatures, develop patterns of radio traffic. But as Allied forces raced across Germany in March and April 1945, operational tempo accelerated beyond anything the Ghost Army had previously experienced. They adapted by developing what they called mobile deception packages, or rapid deployment, kits that could create convincing impressions of major units in hours rather than days. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than creating complete divisional positions with hundreds of inflatable vehicles, they focused on creating what intelligence analysts called diagnostic indicators, the specific signatures that confirmed a unit's presence and identity. For armored divisions, this meant positioning rubber tanks at key road junctions where German reconnaissance was likely to spot them, establishing radio communications on known frequencies, and running sonic broadcasts of tracked vehicle movements. They didn't need to simulate an entire division, just enough elements for German intelligence to conclude a division was present and fill in the rest through assumption. One operation in late March demonstrated the new approach. The 9th Armored Division needed to advance rapidly toward Kassel, but couldn't leave their current sector completely undefended without alerting German forces to the movement. The Ghost Army received 12 hours' notice to create a replacement presence. A single platoon of Ghost Army troops, 37 men, created the impression of a 15,000-man division. They positioned inflatable tanks at 3 key crossroads visible from likely German observation points. Radio operators generated traffic matching the 9th Armored's communication patterns. Sound trucks broadcast recordings of armored vehicles at irregular intervals throughout the night, suggesting a division settling into defensive positions. The deception held for 72 hours, long enough for the real 9th Armored to strike 40 miles away, achieving complete surprise. German forces in the sector where the Ghost Army operated never realized they were facing rubber and recordings. But the rapid advance also created unprecedented dangers. In the fluid situation of a mobile campaign, front lines became indistinct. Units advanced, bypassed enemy positions, left pockets of resistance behind. The Ghost Army sometimes found themselves operating in areas where German forces still held positions or could counterattack. On April 1st, a Ghost Army team near Weimar encountered this reality firsthand. They'd been positioning inflatable equipment to simulate the 4th Armored Division when German forces, remnants of a unit that had been bypassed, launched a local counterattack. Through the area, the Ghost Army soldiers had minimal weapons. Some M1 rifles, a few carbines, no heavy weapons. They weren't equipped or trained for sustained combat. When German infantry and a few tanks appeared moving toward their positions, the team had seconds to make decisions. Some men attempted to deflate and hide the rubber equipment, an instinct to protect the mission. Others immediately ran for vehicles to evacuate. A few grabbed weapons and took positions to provide covering fire. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. American forces from an actual combat unit heard the firing and responded quickly, driving off the German counterattack. But in those 20 minutes, the Ghost Army experienced something they'd spent the entire war avoiding: direct combat while surrounded by their deception equipment. 2 men were wounded. Sergeant Bill Anderson took shrapnel in his leg. Private Eddie Porter was hit in the shoulder. Both survived, but the incident shattered the psychological framework that had allowed the unit to function. They'd always known they were in danger, but they'd operated under the assumption that their deceptions kept them at arm's length from actual combat. That assumption was now proven false. Colonel Reeder addressed the unit the following day. His message was blunt. We're operating in a combat zone where the situation changes hourly. Bypassed enemy units are everywhere. You need to think like combat soldiers, not technicians. Keep weapons immediately accessible. Maintain perimeter security. Have evacuation routes planned. The mission remains important, but your survival comes first. The warning proved prescient. Over the next 3 weeks, Ghost Army teams encountered German forces on 4 more occasions. None resulted in casualties, but each reinforced the reality that the war's final phase was more dangerous for them than earlier operations had been. The psychological impact was significant. Men who'd spent months believing their main risk was discovery now faced the possibility of sudden combat. The stress accumulated. Several men requested transfers to combat units, reasoning that if they were going to be shot at anyway, they might as well be properly armed and trained for it. But the requests were denied. The Ghost Army remained essential. As Allied forces advanced on multiple axes toward Berlin and into southern Germany, the need for deception actually increased. Every real division was precious. Making those divisions appear to be in multiple places simultaneously multiplied Allied combat power. Between March 25th and April 20th, the Ghost Army conducted 14 separate deceptions, an average of 1 every 2 days. Each operation was smaller than the massive Rhine crossing deception, but collectively they contributed to an operational environment where German intelligence consistently misjudged Allied force dispositions and intentions. The operations blurred together in the men's memories. Years later, veterans struggled to recall specific details. Which operation was which towns, which dates. What they remembered was constant movement, setup, and tear-down cycles in rapid succession, exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into a mental fog where you performed tasks automatically without fully processing what you were doing. Private Harold Dahl's diary entries from this period became increasingly terse. March 28th, set up near Marburg, standard package. No incidents. March 31st, displaced to Eisenach area, simulated 6th Armored. Artillery close but not targeted. April 3, another setup. Can't remember the town name. Rubber tanks, sound trucks, radio. Same as always. April 7, moving again. Everybody is exhausted. Making mistakes. Inflated a tank with the turret facing backward. Nobody noticed for 3 hours. The mistakes worried command staff. Exhausted soldiers made errors. Errors in deception work could compromise operations and endanger lives. But there was no time for rest. The war's momentum demanded continuous operations. In mid-April 1945, the Ghost Army received orders for what would be their final operation: simulate the presence of the 75th Infantry Division along the Rhine near Dusseldorf, while the actual division prepared for operations further south. By this point, German resistance had become increasingly disorganized. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Hitler's regime had weeks left, but pockets of fanatical resistance remained, and German forces still capable of organized action continued fighting with desperate intensity. The Ghost Army approached this operation differently than previous ones. The men were exhausted. Equipment was worn. rubber inflatables patched repeatedly, radio equipment failing with increasing frequency, sound trucks needing constant mechanical maintenance. The unit was operating on momentum and professionalism, rather than energy or enthusiasm. They positioned their equipment in a semi-rural area near the river with less precision than earlier operations would have demanded. The inflatable vehicles were spaced properly, but the meticulous attention to detail, the scattered equipment, the worn pathways, the lived-in atmosphere, was less thorough. Everyone recognized they were going through motions they'd performed dozens of times. Radio deception continued professionally. The operators were perhaps the least affected by exhaustion. Their work required mental focus but less physical labor. They generated appropriate traffic, maintained proper procedures, created the electromagnetic signature of a division in defensive positions. Sonic broadcasts ran on schedule. Sound trucks played their recordings at calculated intervals, but the engineers operating them noticed something. German response was minimal. Few reconnaissance flights, limited artillery fire, sparse activity on German radio frequencies. German intelligence was either no longer functioning effectively, or German forces no longer had resources to respond to intelligence. Either way, the elaborate deception felt increasingly like performance art with no audience. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, though the Ghost Army men didn't know or care, they received unexpected orders. Cease current operations and prepare to move to a new sector. Then hours later, those orders were countermanded. Stand by for further instructions. The waiting stretched for 3 days. Men remained in position, maintaining the deception but uncertain whether it still mattered. Radio brought news of Soviet forces entering Berlin from the east. American and British forces were advancing rapidly from the west. The Reich was clearly in its final days. On April 23rd, new orders arrived: dismantle current deception, prepare equipment for transport to rear areas, await reassignment. The Ghost Army had conducted its last operation. The dismantling process felt surreal. Men deflated rubber tanks they'd inflated dozens of times. They packed sound equipment that had projected acoustic illusions across battlefields. They coiled radio cables that had transmitted thousands of fake messages. All the tools of their peculiar warfare were loaded onto trucks for transportation to storage facilities. Nobody was quite sure how to feel. Relief that the dangerous work was ending. Uncertainty about what came next. A strange deflation, literal and metaphorical, as their equipment and mission packed away. Some men felt a sense of incompletion. They'd been preparing for a final dramatic operation, something worthy of ending their unique contribution to the war. Instead, their last mission had been routine, conducted against an enemy who barely responded, ending with administrative orders to pack and stand by. But war rarely provides dramatic closure. It ends in administrative confusion, unclear orders waiting for someone higher up to make decisions. The Ghost Army moved to occupation duties in Germany, performing routine tasks, manning checkpoints, processing displaced persons, administrative functions. For men who'd spent months creating elaborate illusions under combat conditions, the work felt anticlimactic. They were still prohibited from discussing their actual wartime mission. Security classifications remained in effect, so they continued being treated as rear-echelon troops who'd somehow avoided real combat, enduring the subtle contempt from actual combat veterans who didn't understand what they'd actually done. The unit officially deactivated on September 5, 1944. Men received orders for return to the United States, demobilization, return to civilian life. They departed Europe having conducted 21 major tactical deceptions and numerous smaller operations over 11 months of active service. Before leaving, they were given explicit instructions. Do not discuss your wartime mission. The techniques developed by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops remain classified. Tell family members you served in a support unit. Provide no details. Sign additional security agreements. Most complied without question. They'd lived with secrecy for over a year. Maintaining it after the war seemed a natural extension, but the secrecy created a peculiar aftermath. These men had contributed significantly to Allied victory. Their deceptions had saved thousands of lives, influenced major operations, helped end the war more quickly. Yet they couldn't talk about it, couldn't share their experiences, couldn't be recognized for what they'd actually accomplished. They returned to civilian life carrying invisible burdens. The stress of their wartime service hadn't been resolved, just suppressed. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, though in 1945, such conditions were poorly understood and rarely treated. Bill Blass returned to fashion design and built an empire. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most important abstract artists. Art Kane photographed cultural icons. Others returned to quieter lives, teaching, advertising, commercial art, ordinary middle-class American existence. Few talked about the war, even when they legally could have. The experience felt impossible to explain to people who hadn't been there. How do you describe spending months in mortal danger from an enemy you are trying to fool rather than fight? How do you convey the peculiar stress of hoping the enemy believes your lies while standing close enough for them to discover the truth? The Ghost Army remained classified for decades. References in official histories were vague or non-existent. The men aged, retired, grew old, carrying secret histories that most of their families barely knew existed. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, portions of the Ghost Army's mission were declassified. A few articles appeared in military history journals. Some veterans began cautiously discussing their service, but public awareness remained minimal. Rick Beyer, a documentary filmmaker, encountered the story by accident in the 1990s. He spent years tracking down surviving veterans, collecting their stories, discovering the artwork many had created during the war, sketches, paintings, documentation of their unusual service. In 2013, Beyer produced a documentary, The Ghost Army. For the first time, the full story reached public awareness. Veterans who'd remained silent for nearly 70 years finally spoke openly about their experiences. The response surprised them. Rather than dismissing their contribution as less significant than frontline combat, people recognized the Ghost Army's work as a unique form of courage. Operating in danger without weapons, relying on creativity rather than firepower, achieving military objectives through intelligence and deception, it was warfare reimagined. In 2019, Congress passed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. The ceremony occurred in 2024, nearly 80 years after the operations themselves. Few original members survived to attend, but those who did finally received recognition they'd been denied for most of their lives. Bernie Bluestein, one of the last surviving members, spoke at the ceremony at age 99. "We weren't traditional heroes. We didn't storm beaches or charge machine guns. But we did something important. We proved that in modern warfare, brains can be as valuable as bullets. We saved lives by being clever instead of violent. I'm proud of that. I wish my buddies who didn't make it to today could hear people finally understanding what we did." The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their specific operations. They demonstrated principles that remain relevant in contemporary warfare. That deception can be weaponized, that enemy intelligence systems can become vulnerabilities, that small forces using asymmetric methods can achieve disproportionate effects. Modern military deception doctrine, the procedures used by American forces today, traces its conceptual origins directly to the Ghost Army's work. The specific technologies have changed: digital rather than rubber, electronic warfare rather than sound trucks, cyber operations rather than radio spoofing. But the fundamental principles remain identical. The Ghost Army story challenges conventional understanding of military heroism. These weren't men who killed enemies or captured territory through force. They fought with rubber, canvas, paint, and electronics. Their weapon was the human tendency to see what we expect to see and believe what confirms our assumptions. In 21 major operations across 11 months, approximately 1,100 men convinced German intelligence that Allied forces were consistently stronger and positioned differently than reality. They made phantom divisions appear real. They made real divisions disappear. They turned German reconnaissance capabilities, sophisticated and professional, into liabilities by feeding those systems false information that led to false conclusions. The estimated 10,000 to 30,000 lives saved represents real soldiers who returned home because German artillery fired at rubber tanks, real families who weren't destroyed because German reinforcements defended against attacks that never came from directions the Ghost Army indicated. But The Ghost Army's contribution extends beyond statistics. They represented a different kind of courage. The courage to operate in danger without the ability to fight back, to trust in cleverness and precision rather than firepower, to accept that your battlefield was the enemy's mind rather than physical terrain. They endured stresses that few combat soldiers experienced, sustained fear without the release of action, danger without the protection of weapons, importance without recognition. They carried secrets for decades, unable to explain to families, friends, or fellow veterans what they'd actually accomplished. The artists who became soldiers brought unexpected skills to warfare. Their understanding of visual perception, spatial relationships, sound propagation, and human psychology proved as valuable in military operations as marksmanship or tactical training. They demonstrated that modern warfare required diverse capabilities, that victory came through intelligence and creativity as much as through courage and strength. Perhaps most significantly, the Ghost Army proved that in the age of sophisticated reconnaissance and intelligence analysis, those same sophisticated systems could be exploited. German intelligence was excellent. Thorough reconnaissance, effective signals intercepts, skilled analysts. But excellence in gathering information meant nothing when the information itself was false. The Ghost Army weaponized the German military's trust in its own intelligence apparatus. This lesson remains relevant. Modern militaries rely increasingly on sensors, satellites, signals intelligence, data analysis. These systems provide unprecedented awareness, but they also create unprecedented vulnerability if adversaries can manipulate what those systems observe. The Ghost Army's legacy lives on in contemporary military deception, cyber warfare, and information operations. The men themselves rarely claimed hero status. When asked about their service in later years, most described it simply: they'd done an unusual job in unusual circumstances, tried to do it well, and helped end the war sooner. The recognition that finally came in their final years mattered less than knowing their work had saved lives. Bill Blass, the fashion designer who spent 1944 inflating rubber tanks, perhaps captured it best in an interview shortly before his death. "We were artists who became soldiers, but we fought with art rather than weapons. We created illusions on battlefields instead of on canvases. It was the strangest military unit imaginable, but it worked. And when you're in a war, working is what matters." The Ghost Army's story reminds us that warfare isn't only about destruction. Sometimes the most effective military operations are those that prevent battles rather than win them, that deceive enemies rather than destroy them, that save lives through cleverness rather than take them through violence. Between 1944 and 1945, roughly 100 American artists, designers, and sound engineers fought one of history's most unusual campaigns. They wielded rubber tanks and sound recordings instead of rifles and grenades. Their battlefield was perception rather than terrain. Their enemy was German intelligence rather than German soldiers. They called themselves the Ghost Army. And for 70 years, they remained ghosts in history itself, present in the record but invisible in recognition. Only now, as the last members pass away, does their story finally receive the attention it deserves. They proved that in the most violent of human endeavors, sometimes the greatest courage comes not from fighting, but from convincing the enemy to fight shadows while real soldiers strike from unexpected directions. That was their war. That was their victory. And that is their legacy.